Paula, you have heard the name Mark Meadows there a few times, but witness after witness after witness, the transcript after transcript, Meadows' name comes up again and again and seems to be there for everything.
That's exactly right. And while the committee made a conscious decision to focus its final report on former President Trump, it's clear from poring over these transcripts, dozens and dozens of them clearly established the fact that Mark Meadows was at the center of this multifaceted plan to try to overturn the election. Just going through a few examples here. I mean, it starts right around the time of the election. Mark Meadows is the one texting with Donald Trump Jr. about a plan to try to keep Trump in power, a plan that looks exactly like the one that was adopted over the next 2 months. Meadows was involved in pressuring states to overturn their elections. We also learned that he was the one trying to keep some meetings about the election results off the books at the White House and allegedly burning papers in his White House office, including after some meetings with a GOP representative who was involved in pressuring the Justice Department to overturn the election results. We also know Meadows is the one many people reached out to on January 6th to convince the president to come out and be more forceful in denouncing the violence. But I think it's also really interesting what Stephanie said in her interview, how she talked about how the former First Lady didn't really trust Meadows and had some concerns because she was, especially according to Stephanie's testimony, concerned about people who just told the former president what he wanted to hear, and she felt like Meadows was one of those people. Now, Meadows is the common factor in so many of these scenarios and so many of these events, and now it will be up to Special Counsel Jack Smith to establish and to investigate whether this is any criminal conduct we're talking about here.
And that would be the next step. Also, Meadows mentioned in the transcript for Donald Trump Jr., who was asked about the text he sent to Meadows on January 6th. What's that all about? Go ahead.
That's right. They had a few different text exchanges, and the one you're referring to happened while the violence was taking place on the Capitol. And Donald Trump Jr. reached out to the former chief of staff to get him to convince his father to come out and take a more forceful stand against what was happening. Now, of course, the committee was curious, well, why didn't you just reach out to your father yourself? He is, after all, your dad. And he said that, of course, his father doesn't text. He also said he didn't want to call him because he didn't want anyone to overhear the conversation. So he was pressing Meadows to convince his father to do an Oval Office address. Here's some of what he said. He said, look, I think that this takes time. I wasn't in the White House to help. I wasn't there, so I don't know what happened. But I did think we just needed to be more forward and more out there at that point. Now, interestingly, the transcripts involve a lot of instances where Donald Trump Jr. just couldn't recall when asked more specific details, particularly about why he thought his father's tweet about the Capitol Police was not a sufficient response.
Paula, thank you so much for sharing all that. Out front now, former White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham. You were in the room where it happened, or where some of it happened anyway. Let's start with Mark Meadows. He was the president's chief of staff. You would imagine that a lot of things go through him. How much blame do you think he bears for what happened on January 6th, knowing what you know now from the transcripts and the January 6th report?
Well, I'm disappointed to say I wasn't surprised by, everybody talking about Mark Meadows and kind of his role in this. I think he, of course, as chief of staff, holds a lot of responsibility. And I think that he should have been shutting people down the moment they were texting with ideas such as Don Jr.'s idea to have his father keep power. He should have shut that down. He should have, even dealing with the ire of the president or at the thought of being fired, he should have been telling the president, you lost. We need to move on. Certainly on January 6th, he should have been telling him to go out there and say something. At the very least, I mean, that's where, that day I resigned, as you know, maybe he should have resigned. I think that something like that, someone like the chief of staff resigning in protest would have maybe made the president do something. We'll never know. This is me speculating, but I hold him very much in contempt with all of this.
You also testify about what you called a complete 180 from Melania Trump in the weeks running up to January 6th and her refusal to call for peace as the deadly insurrection was at full steam. You testified in part, quote, and I don't have to tell you this, but I'm repeating it. She had started to, in my opinion, drink somebody's Kool-Aid, that perhaps this election was stolen. And because I knew she was up there with the carpet and I was watching violence take place at our Capitol, and she just literally said no to me with no explanation. I mean, I kind of was like, just F you. I was so disappointed in her. Now, you just mentioned you resigned that day. What were you getting from her? Was it that you weren't getting anything or that she started to believe the election lies?
So, after the election, she started to become more distant. And every now and again, she would say, something wasn't right with the election. Something bad went on here. And that just wasn't her. She was always very pragmatic. And she never really believed conspiracy theories. And she was always one of the first people to speak out and advise her husband, when he was not right about something. So it started after the election. My personal opinion is that she knew they were going to be leaving and she was going to, go back to Florida and be in very close proximity with him. I think it was about survival and she didn't want to start anything with him. Again, just my opinion. But then, yes, on January 6th, when I sent her that text, the fact that she didn't say, like, what is going on? Why would we even put that out? Told me she knew what was going on. And the fact that she knew what was going on and just wrote back no was something I couldn't stand for. I had tried to resign a few times between November and January, and she'd always talk me out of it. But that day was just the last straw for me and, several others.
I want to ask you lastly about Cassidy Hutchinson, who, of course, testified. We all saw that, being told that Trump was livid that the Secret Service would not take him to the Capitol after his speech on January 6th. But you testified, quote, that even if Secret Service had given him permission, that man was not going to march down the street with people. I just know him. He's afraid of people. He doesn't want to do those things. And so he was just riling up a crowd that you could tell was already angry. What makes you so sure about that?
Just observing him and knowing him for 6 years, he would often, say, I want to go out in that crowd. And he knew the Secret Service would tell him no. And it was almost a little joke between some of us that he knew what he was doing. So, I think he said, I'm going to go walk with you to rile people up and to get them to actually go to the Capitol. I believe he got angry in the car. Don't get me wrong. But I think it's all for show. That is him. I think he was angry that day and he probably took it out on Secret Service.
Stephanie Grisham, thank you so much for joining us and giving us insight from your perspective. Out front now, Jennifer Rogers, former federal prosecutor. The two people the committee really seemed to focus on are Donald Trump and then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. What kind of things could Meadows face if the DOJ does decide to prosecute here?
Well, Sarah, he could face basically everything that the former president could face. I mean, Mark Meadows seemed to be the center of this conspiracy. He was involved in all of it, the plots to pressure state electors, the plots to pressure state legislatures, the fake initial lawsuits that were filed. He was in the midst of really everything, all the way up to potential insurrection charges. So I think that whatever the DOJ is looking at with respect to former President Trump almost certainly also applies to Mark Meadows as well.
We certainly know the seditious conspiracy charges. We've seen people who have been convicted of that, the Oath Keepers, and that's 20 years potentially in federal prison. So these are really serious potential charges. One of the transcripts released today was from longtime and loyal Trump aide Stephen Miller. He said it's, quote, extreme or outlandish to think that Trump or anyone in the White House would have wanted anything other than peace and harmony on January 6th. That seems to fly in the face of what we saw coming out of their mouths. But what do you say to Stephen Miller?
It's funny, Sarah. One of the things that I think we're seeing in these transcripts, and I know we haven't seen them all yet, but I'm really struck by what's not there. Prosecutors are going to look for evidence that supports charges, each element beyond a reasonable doubt, but they're also going to look for evidence that undercuts that. They need to know whether there is any exculpatory evidence in there. And Stephen Miller is the sort of witness who would try to provide that. But saying general things like, oh, you'd have to be crazy to think that anyone wanted anything other than peace, or the former president's speech was very peaceful. That's not evidence like that. So, what we're really not seeing in any of these transcripts, at least not yet, is evidence that undercuts what the committee's conclusion is. And so if I'm a prosecutor so far, I'm looking at this body of evidence and saying, this looks pretty solid for charges, and I'm not seeing anything contradicting that. And Stephen Miller is the sort of witness who would want to provide that sort of information if he could. And so the fact that you're seeing him, Don Jr., and other witnesses not giving us that sort of thing, I think that in and of itself is really telling.
Jennifer Rogers, thank you so much for your insight.